Good afternoon. I am Diana Burley, Senior Vice President of Research here at Brookings, and on behalf of the team at the Brookings Institution, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on the future of data centers. Data centers are the backbone of the AI revolution. They power the large language models driving digital transformation across almost every sector around the globe. Advances in AI rely on data and require extraordinary data storage and processing power to analyze and act on the information. The Brookings Institution is at the forefront of AI research and analysis, producing evidence-based insights to support sound public policy. Across the institution, our scholars are engaged in research that examines workforce implications, ethics in digital access, governance, economic impacts, and national security. In this webinar, scholars from our Center for Technology Innovation will discuss their recently released, last week, research report on data centers. Co-authors Nicol Turner-Lee and Darrell West study many different aspects of data centers, from their energy and workforce needs to permitting reforms to economic impact. Nicol is Senior Fellow and Director of the Center for Technology Innovation and the author of Digitally Invisible: How the Internet is Creating the New Underclass. Darrell is a Senior Fellow in that center and co-author with John Allen of Turning Point: Policymaking in the Era of Artificial Intelligence. In this webinar, they will summarize the key points of their analysis and lead a discussion with outside experts about the future of data centers. You can find their report on our website at brookings.edu. And with that, thank you for joining us, and I will turn things over to Darrell, who will moderate the discussion.
Well, thank you, Diana. We appreciate your kind words and also taking the time to welcome our audience. So, as she mentioned, I am Darrell West, a Senior Fellow in the Governance Studies program at Brookings, and we are pleased to welcome you to our webinar on the future of data centers. And as Diana mentioned, data centers undergird the AI revolution and the emerging digital economy. They house the file servers and the networking equipment that power AI and other emerging technologies. They make it possible for people to buy things online, engage in financial transactions, and do virtually everything that people do online. But there are a number of challenges in terms of building and operating data centers. Nicol Turner-Lee and I have a new Brookings report out on data centers. We look at barriers to their development and ways to address these challenges. And you can find that report at brookings.edu. In our report, we discuss obstacles to data center construction and operations. Energy is at the top of the list, as we need far greater energy than we have today. We need to develop new sources, including solar, wind, and nuclear energy. It's going to take lots of new production to meet the energy requirements of operating and cooling data centers. Workforce challenges also are part of the situation facing data centers. There actually is a shortage of electricians to wire data centers, plumbers, trade workers, construction workers needed to build these large-scale facilities. So in our paper, we talk about the need for new training programs, apprenticeship programs. There needs to be licensing reforms, especially for electricians. A lot of the licensing requirements for tradespeople are at the state or local level, and sometimes an electrician certified in one state cannot practice in another state. So there needs to be greater portability there. Permitting reforms is a big topic in the data center area. It takes a long time to get all the permits to build and operate data centers. And this is a difficult area because there has been an increase in community opposition to data centers in their own backyard. And so we need to figure out ways to move forward in this way that still addresses community issues. Modernizing the electric grid and power transmission lines will be very important. Electric rates are going up in many places, and we need to figure out how to pay for increased electrical needs. Not all of the rate increases are due to data centers. There are lots of other factors that are driving up the cost of electricity. But there are lots of interesting proposals out there, such as some tech companies are bringing nuclear power sites back online. some states are adopting different provisions on ways to pay for the increased electrical capacity. We need to develop more efficient cooling devices for data centers. The large hyperscaler data centers may have 5,000 or 10,000 file servers in them. The chips can heat up, and so they require a lot of cooling. There are AI tools to improve the efficiency of operation, and there are new materials coming online that can potentially cool with less energy. So this would certainly help a lot on that issue. We're going to talk a little bit today about equity considerations in data center locations. Northern Virginia actually has the greatest concentration of data centers in the country, in fact, in the world, due to its proximity to government agencies. Many of the U.S. data centers today are located either on the East Coast or the West Coast, with far fewer in between. So we need to make sure that the American hinterland is not left behind. Internationally, we have data in our paper on the number of data sites per country, and we found that 2/3 of data centers today are in the United States, Europe, and China. And so the problem is much of Africa, Asia, and Latin America are being left behind, and so we need to address those imbalances so that those places can keep up with the AI revolution. We do not want the global south to be left behind here. So those are some of the report highlights. You can read additional details in the full report found at Brookings EDU. We are going to be doing additional work on data centers in the future. So please stay tuned for future work in this area. So now I'd like to welcome our distinguished panelists to help us understand these and other issues related to data centers. I'm delighted to be joined by three distinguished experts. First is my co-author, Dr. Nicol Turner-Lee. She is the director of the Brookings Center for Technology Innovation and a senior fellow in our governance studies program. She is the author of the Brookings book, Digitally Invisible: How the Internet is Creating the New Underclass. Dr. Kate Stoll is the project director of the Center for Scientific Evidence in Public Issues at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And Kate, that has to be the longest title of anybody I've ever introduced at Brookings, but kudos to you. Kate has also served as a congressional fellow with the U.S. House Committee on Energy and Commerce, and also been a science and technology fellow at the National Science Foundation. Our last panelist is Dr. Michael Blackhurst. He's the executive director of the Open Energy Outlook Initiative at Carnegie Mellon University. He also teaches a course on energy demand and utilization, which of course is front and center in current discussions about data centers. So if you have any questions for our panelists, you can email them to us at events@brookings.edu. That's events@brookings.edu. So Michael, I'd like to start with you, and I know you focus on energy and electric power, and those are big issues with data centers. How do you see the energy situation with data centers, and what do we need to do?
Yeah, thank you so much. We've seen a really rapid growth in the electricity demands required of data centers. About a decade ago, data centers accounted for about 2% of our overall electricity demands. Now that number is around 6%, and in a decade, it's projected to be around 12%. Currently, the state of Texas consumes about 10% of our overall energy demand. So we're talking about a Texas-sized amount of electric power in about a decade from now. And we're starting to see the impacts of that rapid growth in demand for electricity. It's going to cost the average consumer more because we all tap into a shared electric power system, and we're going to need to provide more expensive generation and move electricity around in a more significant way to meet the demands of data centers. We're also starting to see some increase in emissions from the kinds of generators that are used to power our electric power system. Those emissions have negative environmental impacts, and they also could have public health impacts. One thing that I'm excited about is we're starting to see states and utilities take action. They might be ensuring that data centers pay their fair share for our shared electric power system. They might require that data centers use energy that comes from cleaner sources. They might require that data centers provide flexibility in when they can draw demands. And they might require data centers provide community benefits in places where they locate themselves. I will say that I think what we're seeing is that these added costs to our electric power system are somewhat a leading indicator that the industry is not quite ready to regulate itself. And I'm excited to talk about how we can do a better job with that with this group.
No, those are all great issues, and it's nice to see that there are some states that are moving ahead and trying to figure out ways to address this energy situation. So, Kate, I know you work with experts who think a lot about the economic aspects of data centers. What has been the impact of data centers economically? What's the impact on jobs? What has been the impact in terms of tax revenues?
Yeah, so in terms of data centers and economic impacts, of course, jobs are one consideration. Most of the jobs associated with data centers are at the construction phase, so getting it built in the first place. And then fewer are involved in operations in terms of how many people actually need to be at the data center during the lifetime of the data center. I think it's important to point out that not all data centers are the same. Some are massive, hyperscale ones. Some are quite a bit smaller. And location matters a lot. So if you're in a smaller town, maybe a moderate or smaller size data center brings in 100 jobs, that might be a real benefit to your community. And we've seen interviews with people talking about how, this data center bringing in 200 jobs is just the right size for our community. When it comes to revenue, it can be highly variable, also based on location, based on the tax system set up, for example, by county to county. So there was a report across Virginia that was showing huge differences in how much revenue data centers brought to a county. So Loudoun County brought in around 31% of their revenue was from data centers, compared to Prince William County, it was like 7%. And so I think it really depends on the location, and it brings up the point of how important it is to think about local decision making when it comes to data centers. Even there's a national push and a global push and industry push for massive growth in data centers. In the end, it all comes down to siting decisions made by local and county and state decision makers, and how much they can think about the economic development actually benefiting their communities versus the resources that they're balancing against those kind of benefits. So happy to get into more of those discussions as the panel moves on.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. And so, Nicole, Kate is mentioning local considerations, and I know you're my co-author on this report. I know you've thought a lot about the community aspects of data centers. I mean, we know Northern Virginia is kind of the Silicon Valley of data centers. It has the largest concentration of data centers. And so, perhaps not surprising, there's been some resistance owing to concerns about noise, pollution, water needs, power needs, and so on. What challenges do data centers raise for local communities, and what should companies be doing to deal with those concerns?
Well, thank you, Darrell. And it's always a pleasure to work with you on anything. So I'm really happy that we put in the effort to put this paper out here, which has gotten significant interest. I think what the panelists have said so far sort of resonate with the response that I'm going to give in terms of where do local communities fit and factor into this discussion on data centers. And I love the way Kate talks about it as an economic development issue, because in the end, it is, right? Because we're placing into communities infrastructure that in many respects, local communities are counting on for either revenue or for jobs or for some other type of community benefit. With that being said, it's interesting in the last election, and I don't know if many people followed this, but rising electricity costs were one of the factors that really determined who people were going to vote for. So, Darrell, I just have to say this, right? With the recent election of the new governor, it was on her platform to actually address some of the rising utility costs that Michael talked about. But I think people have to understand that the data centers have a purpose as we see how extensive AI is being used, not just by individuals, but by government as well as businesses. And as we see this growing demand, obviously, we're going to need much more capacity and infrastructure to be able to pass through all of these currents of information in ways that make sense and are feasible. And Darrell, you and I talked about this in the paper, right? And even explaining in this paper the different types of data centers. It's no coincidence that we have a lot in Northern Virginia because of our proximity to the government. But I think this is where community benefit agreements become very interesting. We used to have community benefit agreements with local elected officials and appointed officials that pointed to how many jobs are going to be created, what programs were going to come out of any type of economic transaction with a county, a city, or a state. In the case of data centers, we're seeing something quite interesting. So let me kind of talk about this, right? And then Darrell, let it go. We see that we need to build these because we have to accommodate the growing demand of artificial intelligence services in ways that make sense for consumers, businesses, and governments. I mean, I want us to not necessarily, down these opportunities, because we're going to see data centers that are going to do incredible things when it comes to healthcare, incredible things when it comes to education, and we're going to need the capacity to be able to continue to be imaginative and innovate. The same token, as Michael said, we're seeing everyday consumers sort of bear the burden of the electricity costs that are actually keeping these data centers working. And as Kate said, we're seeing a massive amount of production of jobs on the construction side, but very few when it comes to maintaining the center itself. These present challenges for communities in particular that have been exposed to a grid, an energy grid that's not quite been up to par for the last 20 or 30 years. So we're basically overlaying data centers and their electric needs on top of frayed and outdated systems. It also becomes interesting when we get to talk about water. The same thing happens with irrigation systems that are outdated in local communities. On top of that, it's not quite clear to communities what benefit can you extract outside of revenue and utility generation. And I think that's where, again, as we have this conversation, Darrell, becomes interesting because I don't think many communities know what to ask for, right? I think that they want to be part of this this popularization of AI and ways in which they can locate these data centers in their communities, but they're also subjected, I think, to the other side of this conversation we're having, which are some of the challenges that come along with saying yes and not being able to ask the right questions to decision makers on what they should be asking and looking for if this infrastructure is going to be upgraded. And how does that look in communities where they've consistently fought with these utility challenges over the years? So I am a Northern Virginia resident, just put it out there. I see these data centers pretty much every day. But again, I think as we have this conversation, it does pose interesting conversation and challenges about how we see these perk up and what local communities need to do to mobilize around community benefit.
Yeah, Nicole, it's great that you live in Northern Virginia because you are literally on the front lines of these issues. And it's really interesting. Data centers clearly contribute many benefits. Like the AI revolution cannot take place without the computing power associated with the data centers. But as you mentioned, there are issues for local communities. And a lot of these data centers are located on the East Coast, on the West Coast, a few metropolitan areas in between. So we need to kind of think about how communities are feeling about this and how to deal with some of their concerns. So Michael, coming back to you, I know one issue that has come up in some communities is just land use and zoning questions. And so I'm just curious if you could tell us a little bit about what are the issues that have developed here and how communities are handling them.
Sure. Outside of Northern Virginia, a lot of data centers are being located in very rural and remote areas, mostly for security reasons. And so there are communities that aren't typically accustomed to dealing with large industrial customers and may not have the right zoning configuration to accommodate data centers. So the degree to which I think what I really liked about what Nicole said is that communities are unsure how to even ask the right questions to understand the balance of benefits and costs. And in my opinion, the industry should be a little bit more forward about what those benefits and costs are. Like I said earlier, I am excited to see that some states are requiring explicit community benefits packages to host data centers. But it's a whole new industry. It's a whole new industry, and it doesn't always fit into existing zoning paradigms. So communities can learn from each other, and I think that would be another good opportunity for folks to learn what happens in community A. Can they share with community B what they did? I think there's a lot of opportunity to do that.
So Kate, I know that you have spent some time thinking about the water aspects and air quality issues that have popped up in some places. Could you talk a little bit about those issues and how communities are dealing with them?
Yeah, so energy and water are inextricably linked. And a lot of the energy that's used, approximately 40%, depending on the data center and the cooling configuration, about 40% of the energy used for data centers is to keep them cool. So as you mentioned, I think earlier, Darrell, like these chips in the data centers, they run hot and they can't get too hot or then they die. So you really need to keep it cool. And there's different ways of cooling. A fair amount of cooling used by data centers across the US is evaporative cooling. So you end up evaporating a fair amount of water, quite a bit actually, to keep these data centers cool. And so it really depends on kind of the location and the siting of the data centers, what kind of impact that will have on a local community. If you're an arid community and you're using evaporative cooling, that might not be a great choice. Another thing that I think is interesting to think about water is oftentimes it's drawn from municipal systems, right? So it's water that's the whole community is using. And another thing I think that's interesting in terms of water use is that you can use more efficient, like closed loop cooling systems, but it's really important to remember that when you use water efficient systems, you end up having to spend more electricity on those systems. So it's not like it's not always a win-win. You really got to think about your local community, your needs, the climate in your area when you're thinking about these trade-offs. You did mention, Darrell, thoughts about air quality as well. So Michael started to mention this before, which is data centers, they can't go offline. So if there's some sort of interruption in their power, they have to have a backup source of energy. Oftentimes that's on-site generators at the data centers, and these are often powered by diesel. Now they can be of better or worse efficiencies in terms of how many fine particulates or nitrogen oxides that they spew off into the air, but how much those backup generators are used and the local communities around there can be very impacted by air quality, which has direct public health consequences. So it's an important consideration to think about how data centers are handling backup generation and what that means, especially for local communities. And it's not evenly distributed, as I'm guessing Nicole's about to say, like some communities are much higher burdened than others.
Well, Kate, I'm glad you're mentioning these issues, and especially the water issue. Like, there's a lot of attention to the electrical capacity and the energy side of data centers. There seems to be less attention to the water side, but in our paper, we do highlight the water demands and some of the needs that are developing there, and that's something local communities do need to think about. So, Nicol, Kate just called you out on location and equity considerations in regard to data centers, and we know that data centers are not evenly distributed across the country. They're concentrated much more highly in some areas, and other areas don't have any data centers. What are the equity considerations that we need to be thinking about, and how should communities deal with those issues?
Well, no, I'm glad Kate walked back into that question, right? And thank you, Darrell, for bringing it up as well. I mean, let's just be clear. There will be huge economic output when it comes to data centers. I think I read a report by 2030, $7 trillion will actually be investing in data center infrastructure in the country. That also means that these companies will be discerning as to where they put these resources. So obviously, places that we know they will not go are probably very hot climates, right? Where it's going to be even tougher to cool many parts of the components. I had an opportunity to see one of the components. I'm about 5'6". It was as tall as me. And as we see quantum develop, we're going to see various layers of stack of what happens with these components that are going to require more of these resources that we're discussing. With that in mind, obviously there'll be discernment on where the investments go. And so far, Virginia, Texas, and California, well, actually Virginia, California, and Texas in that order, top the places in which we're seeing most data center development, and obviously California because of Silicon Valley. With that being the case, there will be communities that will not have access to data centers. And in many respects, they'll be part of the AI, what I call not the digital divide, but the AI chasm, because they'll be further away from the resources that allow them to have less latency and lag when it comes to their ability to get online and do the things that everyday people are doing with AI tools. One of the things I keep thinking about, Darrell, too, and Kate sort of brought it up as well, is, we have this great opportunity with data center infrastructure to actually build equity into how we think about community economic development. What do I mean by that? It's no secret that the current energy grid is old and outdated, as I stated, and Michael sort of suggested as well. But when we're thinking about these like parallel energy and irrigation systems, are we making sense for communities that have not had the ability to be upgraded at all? And I worry a little bit about that to our friends who are listening from the data center world, that we're going to build these parallel systems that do not touch the communities that in many respects in rural areas or impoverished areas could benefit from some type of modernization of the transmission lines. I also worry, to Kate's point, the AI action plan that came out of the Trump administration is basically preferencing data center development by removing and expediting environmental remediation concerns. We won't know enough about the environmental impacts, and that's an equity concern. I mean, where people live and the type of pollutants that they're exposed to are equity concerns as well. And so sort of thinking through, how do you balance this increasing demand for technology, but you do it in a way that still centers humans, should be a point of conversation. Because I think local communities, as we've talked about, that don't know what to ask, are not going to understand why the data center is getting all the perks and the privileges while they're still struggling with toxic water systems and bad energy grids, right? And so again, I know it's not easy to work with them. I commonly tell people, I've been through this before with the 5G revolution. It took us a long time to figure out how to put those radios on shared utility poles in ways that made sense to advance mobile connectivity. I think we're going to have the same type of impasse here, that we need the support of local communities as we did with the 5G revolution to ensure that they can actually have some skin in the game as these data centers evolve. So yeah, I think equity, Darrell, is just going to be across the board, right? It should be a conversation that's baked into where these data centers arise. You also talked about the shortage of electricians. Perhaps one other way to sort of help with that is, if we know we're not going to have a lot of jobs on the output, maybe data companies could actually invest in the trades and figure out ways in which they can put money as a community benefit and advancing that small community of 100 or so jobs, where some of those jobs can be locally harvested. So I'll stop there, because Darrell, you already know me. When you get me started on anything technology, and now we talk about data centers, I'm like a Baptist preacher. I'll just keep on going. But the key thing is, these are the conversations that I think communities need to have in partnership with these industry partners who are really putting the money into getting this right. I don't think for any reason there should not be some type of cooperative conversation that's participatory in many ways to get to a closer end game that's much more equitable and inclusive.
Well, Nicole, the good news is there are some companies that actually are developing these apprenticeship programs and other types of relationships with the professional trades areas in order to try and facilitate the construction. And this could provide payoffs for the community in other ways. Like after the data centers are built, these people then would be available to help in other areas as well. So I have one last question for the panelists, and then we're going to take some questions from our audience. And that just concerns the possible benefits of data centers. So we talked about some of the barriers, some of the issues that have come up, ways to deal with some of those. What are the benefits of data centers? Talk about economic benefits, benefits in terms of data access and digital access, building the infrastructure for AI and other applications. What do each of you see as the benefits? And Michael, we can start with you.
Well, I think there was a number of possible benefits mentioned earlier, benefits to medicine. There's possible applications to environmental improvement. And I don't mean to be too negative here, but I do think the downstream applications of AI are really uncertain. They could be beneficial, and they could introduce a lot of new risks. We should reflect a bit upon how social media was offered as a pure benefit, and it had some hidden costs. We reflect upon how screens were offered as a pure benefit, and it had some hidden costs. So I really like the fact that this cohort is focused on sharing the benefits and keeping the conversation very active. I liked what Nicole said about equity quite a bit. I like the fact that states are really focused on ensuring that they're not encumbering their citizens with additional costs. That could be costs in terms of public health, pollution, increased prices. But I think I would like to see the industry demonstrate with more proof what those benefits are. And I'd really like to see communities continue to hold AI companies and data center companies accountable to those benefits.
Kate, what do you see as the benefits of data centers?
Yeah, so I like to continue where Michael left off, which is the benefits will only be realized if we have more transparency to collapse the information asymmetry that seems to be common between data center operators and local decision makers. And that requires more transparency. Water is a great example where it's harder to get rigorous, standardized data on how much water is being used or not. And that's the way that communities will get the most benefit, whether it's economic benefits or infrastructure investments, for example, is if they can ask those questions, as Nicole was saying, be able to know which questions to ask about water, about energy, about land use, about the community benefits that can come from this. So I guess I'll answer with the more benefits will come from greater transparency and informed decision making.
Okay, Nicole, what do you see as the benefits?
I mean, I'll add, and I feel bad because I want to do both, Darrell. I want to do benefits and some other additional opportunities. I'm like kind of Michael, right? I don't want to be dystopian because I think, obviously AI has increasing demand and we do need infrastructure to be able to power that. I mean, the people do not realize, and I often say this to people, a search on generative AI, you just multiply that by trillions of people, and then you realize why we have to build these data centers if we want to ensure that the AI products that are delivered back to us are seamless and efficient, particularly in high risk scenarios, like in the case of public safety and national security. It's really important that we build these data centers to accommodate that. I think the benefit to a community that does get a data center is it means that, you will have access to probably better resiliency when it comes to your ability to do some of these things. But I just can't leave without sort of taking your question like Michael and sort of bending the rules here. We have to also remember that in these opportunities, there are also some long-term benefits. Right now, the data center model that we're using in the US is very utility intensive. The amount of power and water that we need is a little different than what we're actually seeing with the DeepSeek model in the Chinese, among the Chinese innovators and the state. My point here is, as we are building these data centers, we are also betting that the AI economy is going to be strong. And so I think it's important for us to think about all the things that go into building these data centers and what the market fluctuations might provide if we do not get the level of adoption, or we do not meet the energy demands, or we're seeing these parallel systems be developed around these data centers. And then there's an AI bubble. Darrell, you just wrote about that in a blog. It was very good read, by the way. What happens is there's an AI bubble, and then we'll have data centers that are no longer needed in communities. Can that space be repurposed into something else, a community center, a gym, an incubator? I think these are questions that I think take the opportunity metric from being a very short-term look into something that's a longer tail. We know, a new technology will replace AI at some point, or AI will be enhanced by something else. Are we thinking about ways in which we actually, ride that opportunity wave and to ensure that these do not just become abandoned buildings and communities? So I wanted to put that out there, along with the fact that we didn't talk much about the nuclear reactor recommissioning and what that's going to look like if we cannot find the sufficient power structures to be able to keep these generators going. Where are they going to be located? I mean, there's a lot to be said about the safety of micro nuclear sites, but what does that mean for communities that for a long time, looked at the environmental concerns? So again, I think the opportunity is that we're getting communities, hopefully in industry, to come together around a huge economic development opportunity. It's been a long time since we've had that conversation. And the opportunity is that perhaps there'll be some pressure on utility companies to upgrade the grid, because that has been something, Michael, you know this, that for 20 plus years we've not done. So maybe there'll be a little bit more pressure to do something differently with our utility structures.
Yeah, we definitely need to upgrade the grid. So we're starting to get some questions from our audience, and those of you who are watching who have questions, feel free to send them to us at events@brookings.edu. That's events@brookings.edu, and we'll try and get to as many of your questions as possible. So one question that has come in is, several states have been pursuing tax incentives, especially sales, use, and limited property tax exemptions for building and maintaining data centers. The question is, how essential do you believe these tax incentives are in order to facilitate the creation and maintenance of new data centers? Any of you who want to jump in on that?
I can say a little bit because I've seen that I think it's like around 36 states that actually have passed legislation with tax abatements specifically for data centers. Um, and some of them are tying those tax abatements to bringing benefits to their state, and others are it's just kind of the tax abatement to draw the data centers in. And so I think this is an area where states and counties can be thoughtful about how they're negotiating and what ways they want to bring community benefits in exchange for the tax abatements, or to think about what they could be doing with the revenue that they are or aren't gathering. So I'll stop with that.
Yeah, I agree with Kate. I mean, we've seen the use of tax incentives and tax abatements whenever there's some type of new commercial endeavor. And we've seen that used in areas where, again, I think Kate hit it right on the nose, right? Where there's limited revenue among states and counties to reinvest that into something else. Education, they're able to use that in many respects, and make these promises. Again, I think it goes back to having a longer tail vision of how these abatements and tax incentives work, so that we don't get to a period in time where we have overbuild of many of these data centers in areas where now it's an eyesore, it's not being used for an economic advantage, which can happen when the state sort of gives up the store without thinking about the longer tail costs.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I think that's great that there are some states that both have tax incentives for development, but also have high costs to tap into the grid. And so there could be conflicts there. So thinking about coordinating those different policies could be useful to decision makers.
Okay, another question is, how is the U.S. going to address the regulatory barriers to upgrading the electric grid?
Well, that is a helpful question, because the way we plan for capacity expansion in the power sector is really decentralized. We have many different actors, and we have different practices from one area to the other. You could have a local utility involved. You could have the state PUC involved. You could have a regional operator involved. You could have the federal government involved. And so I do think there's a need to think about overhauling how we expand the capacity electric power sector. We also have fragmentation across different areas of concern. So we have environmental issues separate from public health issues, separate from affordability issues, separate from safety issues. So I do think there's a way to do that. This is a good example. Data centers are a good example on how we could do a better job for planning for increased demand and expanding the electric power sector.
Yeah, all I would add to Michael is I have nightmares. Michael, I worked on smart grid issues early in my career. And I see this as sort of a regurgitation of a lot of that discussion. I think when Scott Blake Harris and others were there at the Department of Energy trying to figure out what were some good strategies for advancing and modernizing the grid. And we still haven't been able to do that yet, right? And now, unfortunately, I mean, I think it's worth saying for this panel, the utility sector and the telecom and now big tech sector often do not have shared goals. And so that also makes it very difficult to be able to put that type of investment in an ailing grid while expediting and accelerating access to technology. Those competing values, I think, also get in the way.
What I think is exciting about this, and hearing both you and Kate talk, is that communities seem to be much more precautionary about siting data centers now. They've learned some lessons, and maybe there's a real opportunity for them to band together and say, we insist that this is the kind of service that we are going to have if we're going to welcome you into our community. So I think that's new and exciting.
Okay, Michael, that actually leads into our very next question. There's a question: is there an emerging best practice model for communities to ensure that data centers help them build their economy and create economic benefits, and then do not negatively impact their well-being or their environment?
Well, I'll start. I mean, I've been watching what's happening in Prince George's County, Maryland, which I found to be quite interesting. There was an intrigue to bring data centers, I think, in competition to what the state of Virginia was doing. And there was an immediate like pushback, right? It was a couple of months ago. And just recently, the county convened leaders in a local town hall to talk about it. I think one of the best practices that is going to emerge, much like what Michael and Kate are talking about, is, getting community actors to sit alongside industry and do better education on what these benefits of data centers are. I think that should be number one. We don't have to necessarily, until the construction phase, really put out these public notices about the construction of these buildings. But it is worth having the same type of exercise that we do with any type of economic development model and bringing the community together with industry to talk through what the goals and objectives are. I think that's the first step. I do think it's also important for this to be a participatory model, and a best practice is to do some landscaping as to the data center location and, again, what those affiliated and associated community benefits could be. It's going to be very difficult to just place data centers in areas where there are none and figure out like how they actually work in ways that actually involve community. Virginia, I think they've done it enough times. They sort of probably have a cookie cutter model. We'd love to. Darrell, we've talked about this as part of the next stages of the paper, to take each piece and sort of give some color to each of the pieces that we reference in that paper. So for those of you listening, we're in this for the long haul. We welcome your feedback and comments and other people we need to talk to. But definitely, I think it starts with some shared values and goals, as well as some type of participatory framework so that you hear from all the actors that are affected. And then maybe, Michael and Kate, some templated model language, right? Could also be helpful for communities to know what questions they should ask from industry in many respects. And if there are resolutions and other things that have to be developed, here's some model language to ensure that it's going to be a win-win on both sides.
Sure. I think some leading actors in this space, Michigan has a tariff that was recently approved of. That would be helpful language. Nevada has a clean transition tariff that was approved of earlier this year. Texas SB6, a slightly different market, but similar outcomes. But I think the general principle that I'm seeing in the power sector is we want the data centers to pay their fair share for the infrastructure upgrades that are required to operate the data centers. And there are different policy strategies to do that in different states. I gave you a couple of examples. You can negotiate community benefit plans in consultation and collaboration with communities and data center providers. There's also states that require clean energy be procured to power data centers. And then there's some movement to require data centers to generate power, quote unquote, behind the meter. So they generate their own power. We do want to get away from these backup diesel generators that Kate mentioned, which can be really dirty.
Yeah.
So Michael, go ahead, Kate. No, go ahead, Kate.
I'll just add on a little bit that location matters so much because you have different climates. Your peak hottest months are going to be the part you have to think about the most clearly when it comes to water usage and the types of approaches you want the data center to be taking to think about energy efficiency and water efficiency. And so really using the scientific evidence for your region, your specific locality, to try to make the best decisions, and demanding that energy and water efficiency best practices are put to use, and then requiring reporting on, especially on water use, which is not clearly and transparently reported. Monitoring that and following up and auditing that are powerful ways for localities to reduce the poor impacts and data centers, I should say.
Yep, no, those are all great points, Kate. So, Michael, you mentioned this notion of the community benefit agreement. So, first of all, could you actually explain to our audience what those agreements are? And then there's a question that actually came in on them. What trends are you seeing in community benefit agreements? And especially, this person mentions investments in green infrastructure and how that's affecting data center operations.
Well, I will first underscore what Kate just said, which is we are missing a lot of information about how data centers actually impact communities. So that could be part of a negotiation with a data center provider. Communities can demand that they have the right information to make good decisions. and hold data centers accountable to that information. So I really do want to underscore that we need more transparent information about the impacts of data centers. I don't know that I would say that there are trends at this point in community benefits packages with data centers. I think there are just too few of them, but there are probably other areas where there have been community benefits packages negotiated with other industries. I do know that in terms of requiring clean energy, the Nevada Clean Transition Tariff requires the use of clean energy, so that might be a good place to start. There are other states that require clean energy. I'll do a little bit of digging here and report back to the group in a live format. But I do think Nicole and Kate would be better experts on community benefits packages.
Yeah, I mean, I'll add into, and thank you for that, Michael. I mean, the community benefit agreements have traditionally been, what are the accrued value back to communities, essentially based on the continuum of severity that the potential merger acquisition infrastructure will have on that community. And in my experience doing this work, oftentimes the community benefit agreement overcompensates for some of the potential harms that may occur in a community. And at the same token, it sort of thinks forward in terms of where money can be spent to build the capacity of that community in which they're in. So what's so interesting about the data center model is, as we've suggested, it's not clear the types of jobs that are going to be needed in the long tail part of this, right? Which are not necessarily data science jobs or computer science jobs. And so a traditional community benefit agreement might include, we're going to invest this amount of money in computer science folks, and so Darrell, I think your point about, where we're seeing industry partner with the trades and apprenticeships could be interesting. But again, those might be more pre-construction or construction time jobs that might not have lasting value. I think in the case of what we're speaking about in terms of the question around clean energy initiatives, we also have to put these data centers in the context of the current political climate. We've seen so many rollbacks on renewable energy. We've seen a lot of diminishing of importance when it comes to clean energy. And those are going to factor into these conversations that especially industry is going to sort of put before local communities when they do ask of these concerns. And so I think that's something for all of us that are having this debate. You really have to also tether this to the climate that we have in energy more broadly and the utility sector more broadly. These are not being done in isolation of the current political climate, which in many respects will, drive for faster, bigger, better, stronger deployments in the absence of the type of regulatory certainty that we've had in the past when it comes to being much more diligent and much more concerned about, clean energy resources and renewable energy resources. I, like Michael, think that that's a fascinating question, right? Because if states are any indication of how they're navigating through the political climate, they're going to pay attention to that more than it will be a national imperative. And I think, Michael, thank you for pointing out those states, because I think they will use their own economic and social capital to assert back into the equation what they would like to see versus what we're seeing on the national level when it comes to the energy sector more broadly.
So we have a question about AI bubbles, which I'm going to answer because I actually just wrote a Tech Tank post on this. But the question is, what is the company model for recouping the massive investment in data centers that the various companies have been talking about? And I'll just give a few thoughts on this, and any of the rest of you who want to jump in are welcome to do so. And of course, this topic basically kind of gets into the fact that the large tech companies are now investing hundreds of billions of dollars. In fact, some estimates say when you look at the sector as a whole, we may be talking about $2, $3, or $4 trillion over the next few years being invested in data centers. And so almost every day now there's an article like, is there an AI bubble? Like, are the companies going to be able to make in revenue what they get back? So in my Tech Tank post of a few days ago, I basically try and outline a number of indicators that people can watch to help themselves answer that question. Like, none of us actually can predict this. The whole thing about a bubble is they're unpredictable. The tulip bubble in the Netherlands, the .com bubble from 20 years ago, like nobody really forecast those types of things. But there are indicators that we can watch. So obviously one is just how many dollars are being invested in this. And then on the revenue side, what are the types of revenues that companies are going to be able to get out of the AI applications, the AI agents, and the AI assistants that now are being developed. So all these companies are developing generative AI models. They are selling those models to consumers at a fairly affordable price. They're selling them to governments and businesses, generally at higher rates. And so one can kind of look at how quickly the innovations are spreading, how widely they're being adopted, and then what kind of revenues the companies are developing based on those products over a number of years. So that can give you a sense of, are they going to get the money back that they've invested here? But the other thing I highlight in my post, and I think this is something that is overlooked, like a lot of the revenue projections depend on how rapidly one expects this whole AI revolution to take off, to diffuse, get adopted by consumers, businesses, and governments. And one of the things I highlight is the importance of public trust in technology. When you look at public opinion surveys now, there's actually a fair amount of skepticism about AI. Like every day, there are news stories that AI are going to take your jobs, that there's cybersecurity risks, there are privacy invasions, there are chatbots and questions about how this is affecting the mental health of teenagers. Like, we've all seen all these stories. And I think the thing that companies need to focus on is not just building the products, but thinking about ways to build in human safeguards so that the products that are coming online are safe and people understand that they're safe and the companies can depend on them, governments can depend on them, and just kind of thinking about how can we build the public trust in a way that the public will adopt these tools. If the public is skeptical about AI or worried or anxious about AI, that will probably slow the diffusion. That will then slow the revenue model, and then that increases the odds of an AI bubble bursting. But if the public is trusting of these new applications, they're going to adopt them more rapidly. Companies can probably charge more money because people are confident in the products. And then the AI bubble is not going to break. It's going to actually generate the hundreds of billions or trillions that will justify these expenditures. But if any of the rest of you have any thoughts on that, I'd be happy to hear them.
Sure, I really like that. I think the other side of that coin is we have a really unique opportunity to shape the winner, the AI winner that we want to have in society. I try to make the case sometimes that when you go to the doctor and get a pill, you don't have to worry about the balance of benefits and risks. And there's a whole regulatory mechanism behind that. Here, we're faced with a tremendous amount of uncertainty about the balance of benefits and risks. But if we continue to have the kind of conversations that Nicole and Kate have motivated, we are good partners with industry, we can ensure that the product that's being developed is what we want. And I think that's what's really different. There's a lot of precautionary thinking that's being applied to AI and data center development. That is very healthy, and I'm excited to see that. And that's one of the reasons I joined this panel.
Now, I would add too, I think echo everything that's been said so far between Darrell, you and Michael, and I'm sure Kate's going to add on to this. I think part of the other challenge too is, and we don't talk about it a lot, we do mention in the paper, there is also this assumption that we're not balancing the growth of telecommunications infrastructure for people to get access to AI products right now, right? And so, yes, there will be a public trust concern and whether or not we're going to win the big bet on whether or not people actually adopt AI at the same scale and pace that they're doing right now, and it's only going to go up. Michael talked about, just the attention and dependency on screen time. Those are other conversations that are happening in civil society pretty much, right? But they will impact the trustworthiness of AI, and it may or may not impact the business model. We'll see. But most importantly, we know right now that we still need telecommunications infrastructure to be robust and vibrant, because that is how consumers and others are interacting. We're not yet at the point. I know we're going to get there where we'll see more disaggregated AI points. I know we're seeing it now in terms of appliances. You don't necessarily, just wrote a paper on this, you don't necessarily have to be on a laptop or a phone anymore. You could be with your refrigerator, and there's AI embedded to tell you what you actually have in there to eat. There's AI that's embedded on our TV screen. So I think we're not at the stage yet where we can move away from the dependency on the type of internet access points, which is why this conversation is really important. We want this to work because ultimately, from a public interest standpoint, we want more people connected. But I also say, Darrell, too, we also have to watch China. I think the reason that we're going so fast is that our competition is with China. But guess what? China is developing low power, low energy sucking models. And we may need to think about in the next 5 to 10 years if we're actually going to choose a lower compute environment, which will make our investments today a little worthless in the future, or at least they may be able to accommodate other parts of the AI ecosystem. So these are questions that we put in the paper. And I'm so glad, Michael, you did join us. I just want to tell you that, and Kate, because here's the conversation that we were hoping to have.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one more to put a fine point on bringing this back to data centers and the local impacts is that I'm not going to predict whether or when AI bubble will happen, but if there was a big bust, then there's a possibility of like stranded assets, the electrical infrastructure built up for, in large part to the growth of these data centers. And we don't want local communities stuck with that bill in the end, right? So thinking about that in advance, especially when we know that a lot of the data center operators have interconnection requests at multiple places per data center. So they won't necessarily build every time they make an interconnection request in that location. Does that make sense? So thinking about how to consider local leaders and communities and how they don't get stuck with the costs if there is stranded assets in the end.
No, I think that's a very important point, Kate, because we actually cannot let this bubble burst because the utility companies are going to be building new electrical capacity. Communities are developing their own infrastructures. They're putting a lot of money into this. So this is it's too big to fail at this point. Like it would just be a disaster if something like that happened. We have time for one last question. A question has come in. What incentives should be put in place to get data center operators to release more energy and water data so localities can plan better and assess kind of the cost-benefit ratio for their local communities?
My opinion is that there shouldn't need to be an incentive. I mean, if you want to operate in a community and you're going to have an impact, that information should be made available to decision makers.
But you might have to write it into your local ordinances or require it as part of your zoning for these large energy and water users. Otherwise, it might not happen just voluntarily.
Mm-hmm. And I would just say that part. I'll end it there.
Okay, well, I want to thank Nicole and Kate and Michael for a tremendous conversation. We've covered a lot of material here. Again, those of you who are interested in the details on the report that Nicole and I just put out, you can find our report on the future of data centers at brookings.edu. We also write regularly on these topics at our Tech Tank blog. Nicole and I talk about these topics regularly on our Tech Tank podcast, and you can find both of those things at brookings.edu. So to our audience, thank you very much for tuning in.